Help give kids an extra life by donating today to help sick and injured children. Link in the description and pinned comment below.
What in the... This isn't right. Isn't there supposed to be a driver in there?
Yep, that's me. You're probably wondering how I got into this situation. Well, it started a couple years ago. Okay, so it's like this. Back in April of 2021, some dingus calling himself SDK left a Gashat on my table with the data for Galaxian, a game which, let's be fair, I was planning on looking at anyway. Guess someone was losing patience with me. So I covered not only Galaxian, but all the arcade games in the Galaxian series, only to realize that SDK was Shin Dan Kuroto, who no doubt was interested in trolling me.
Flash forward to today, and now I find a Xevious Gashat in a Desire Grand Prix mission box. How Dan managed to sneak this out of DGP headquarters, I'll never know, but here we are. At least I know which game series I'm looking at next.
And it isn't like Xevious is some small-time game either. Today, it may be slightly lower on the totem pole of fame below the likes of Pac-Man and Galaga, but considering the initial impact it made, especially in Japan, it deserves mention in any list of Namco's most legendary arcade games. And as an early shmup, its influence on the genre is undeniable. Games like Konami's Twinbee and Taito's Rayforce took a lot of inspiration from Xevious, and the game would become a franchise in itself, not to mention it would be a mainstay in almost every iteration of Namco Museum, which they tend to release for almost every platform nowadays. So what is it about Xevious that made it such a success and vaulted it into the ranks of arcade legends? Well, that's what I'm here to talk about. As for why Kuroto was daring me to do this, well, maybe this will bring me closer to the answer I've been looking for. Interestingly enough, before it was Xevious, the game was something very different. It was designed by Masanobu Endo, who joined Namco as a planner in April of 1981. He was assigned to a small team to create a two-button shooter to compete with Scramble, which was released by Konami in 1981. Early versions of the game were set during the Vietnam War under the title of Cheyenne, possibly named after an experimental helicopter by Lockheed. Eventually, after a reorganization of the team and the resignation of the game's original planner, Endo took charge of the project, learning programming on the fly. In terms of gameplay, Endo wanted the game to be inviting for new players, with the difficulty gradually increasing in certain ways as the game progressed. He also wanted the game to have a consistent, detailed world and a story that was a central part of the game. The design for the sprites in the game was influenced by ray tracing to be as detailed as possible, while fitting within the limitations of the Galaga arcade board. Endo himself designed many of the sprites himself, with cooperation from Hiroshi Mr. Dotman Ono. As for the characters and structures, many were designed and refined by Shigeki Toyama, who had worked on robotics for Namco's amusement centers in the past. These ships had many sci-fi influences, including Star Wars, UFO, Battlestar Galactica, and Alien. The game was location tested in Japan in December of 1982, with a release in Japanese arcades the following month to kick off 1983. Atari would obtain the US licensing rights for the game, releasing it stateside in February, billing it as the Atari game you can't play at home. Yeah, that aged like milk that was left on the counter. So let's pop a quarter in the slot and start this baby up! So like I said before, Xevious is a vertically scrolling shooter. You pilot a fighter plane called the Solvalou against the invading Xevious forces. As I mentioned, this game was designed to be a rival to Konami's Scramble, and as such, your aircraft has two weapons. A zapper, which fires projectiles to attack airborne targets, and a blaster for bombing targets on the ground. To help you with your aiming, not only do you have a reticle for your blaster, but when you use it, you'll see a marker on the ground to show you where your bomb is gonna land. Simple enough. The reticle also flashes when it's over a target, which is not only useful in general, but can also help you find hidden soul citadels for bonus points. The idea for the latter was initially dismissed by Namco's execs, so Endo claimed it was a bug so that he could leave it in. Pretty sneaky, son. The interesting part is the various ways the game handles progression. See, there are 16 consecutive areas which loop back around. However, if you die after progressing through at least 70% of an area, you'll respawn at the beginning of the next one, as one does. Each area has distinct designs, with environments including forests, rivers, roads, and buildings. You can even see geoglyphs which resemble the Nazca lines. Hey look, it's Viracocha Rasca!
Somebody call Team 5Ds, let them handle it. They've taken down a condor before, they can do it again.
Then there's difficulty, and it's handled in a unique way. Initially, you fight simple, easier enemies, but as you destroy more of them, you'll eventually encounter trickier ones. However, by bombing certain radar dishes on the ground, you could dial back the difficulty to a previous group of enemies. This was an interesting approach to this style of shooter, as opposed to, simply adding more and fiercer enemies. At certain points, however, you had to deal with the Andor Genesis mothership, which assaulted you with projectiles and explosive black Zakatos. To destroy these things, you could either bomb the core, or the 4 blasters that surrounded it. You could also obtain extra lives by either scoring enough points or collecting hidden special flags. The latter was added because Endo was a fan of Rally X. Now this game was relatively simple, but extremely influential, being one of the first vertically scrolling shooters. The sprites and backdrops look impressive for the era, featuring a higher level of detail than most games at the time. The sound effects were on point as well, though having only the Lifestar jingle and one single background track for music was probably all that could be expected on early 80s hardware at the time. More importantly though, fans and critics lauded the addictive and fast-paced gameplay, which was only helped by its unique approach to difficulty progression. While it was a modest success in America, back in Japan, the game shattered records. In its first few weeks, it had amassed sales figures the likes of which hadn't been seen since the likes of Space Invaders. This game rivaled freaking Space Invaders, and home ports of the game were praised for being faithful to the original. In fact, the Famicom port was considered to be the system's first true killer app, even before Super Mario. The game's popularity led to high score tournaments, the publishing of strategy guides, and more. It's also credited for being one of the first games to include a boss fight, a backstory, and pre-rendered graphics, all of which are commonplace today. The lore of the game was even documented in a series of books, which eventually even got a CGI film adaptation. Music based on the game was even included on what is considered to be the first video game soundtrack album. Not only that, it was part of the first recording of video game footage, as well as the first commercial for a video game. That's right, folks, were it not for Xevious, the Let's Plays and trailers we know today might not be the same. So, given the success of Xevious, sequels and spin-offs were inevitable. A more challenging version of the game called Super Xevious was released in 1984, which included more aggressive enemies, including some new ones, some of which could reset your score. However, the first true follow-up would be one of said spin-offs, called Grobda, which was released in October of 1984 in Japan and almost a year later worldwide. This game featured one of the enemies in Xevious, a tank which originally served little purpose other than evading your bombs. Endo thought that giving this tank weapons would be funny, so he and his team took 3 months to develop the game. That's right, a spin-off was developed in a highly accelerated time frame and on a shoestring budget, essentially for the lulz. The game itself is a multi-directional tank battle game of hit or be hit, over 99 levels of action, and your tank is equipped with a laser for blasting, and a shield that you can deploy to protect yourself as long as the gauge holds out. It's like an evolved version of Atari's Combat. When tanks are destroyed, the explosion can take out nearby tanks, so if you're clever, you can chain explosions together, almost like Missile Command. Of course, enemy tanks leave behind debris when destroyed, and it slows your tank down when you drive over it, almost like Die Hard on NES. While Grobda didn't have the same level of success as Xevious did, it was far from a failure, and it has seen several re-releases in Namco Museum collections, including a remixed version in Namco Museum Megamix. Next on the lineup is a Famicom exclusive sequel called Super Xevious Gamp no Nazo, or Mystery of Gamp, which dropped in 1986. This was quite different from the Super Xevious in the arcades, as for one, each level required you to solve a puzzle of some kind in order to progress. Puzzles? In my shmup? It's more likely than you think. And second, you could obtain various power-ups like shields or stronger shots. Unfortunately, those changes weren't exactly well received, and the game failed commercially. Endo-san wasn't even involved since he'd left a year ago to found his own company. He didn't even like the idea of a sequel to Xevious. Of course, Namco continued the series onto other platforms, including the Japan-only MSX2 with a couple of titles, including Xevious Faradaut Saga, released in 1988, which was a new 16-stage campaign which featured power-ups and multiple ships. The game tried to build on the original mechanics instead of what they did for the Famicom sequel. This version was developed with the help of Compile, who was responsible for the original Puyo Puyo. An alternate version called Xevious Faradaut Densetsu was released in 1990 in Japan for the PC Engine, also known as the TurboGrafx-16 in America. This version wasn't a straight remake, however, but a different game which featured a new 4-stage campaign that included new power-ups. Neither one was particularly successful, and reviews are rather mixed. As for the other MSX2 game, it's a bit of an interesting case. You see, in 1990, Namco started a short-lived disc digest called Disc NG, which largely compiled previous Namco MSX games. There was an exclusive title on each disc, and the first disc, released in March 1990, included a game called XVM, and it was Xevious in everything but name. It was basically standard Xevious with the addition of power-ups and segmented levels with bosses. Nothing to write home about, but an interesting footnote. As is this next spin-off, Solvalou, an arcade title named after the signature ship of the franchise. This game, released in 1991 and Japan exclusive, again, was a 3D rail shooter played from a first-person perspective. Like usual, you have a zapper and a bomb, but you can only launch 5 bombs at a time, after which they need to regenerate. Also, instead of lives, you have shields which deplete from damage, and once they're gone, one more hit will finish you. This was one of the games that was built on Namco's System 21 arcade board, like Galaxian 3. While the game wasn't a commercial success, critics praised its immersion and gameplay, and retrospective reviews have also been positive. It did get a re-release on the Wii's Japanese Virtual Console, but with that service down, we can only hope for another re-release somewhere down the line.
Or you could just, emulate it.
Next, remember that Namco Classic Collection that gave us Galaga Arrangement? Well, it gave us one for Xevious as well, and honestly, it's one of the best ways to update a classic game. Its gameplay is largely unchanged, but it does have several enhancements that make it a better package. For one thing, each of the game's 16 areas has its own background theme, which mix into one another very nicely. There's also more variety in the environments between lush forests and mechanical bases. There was also more variety in the bosses, with each one having a distinct design. Then there was the level setup. There were 16 main areas with the credits at the end. However, especially good players could unlock the 3 super hard extra stages at the end of the game. Of course, finding the rare power-up could increase your chances significantly. Possibly the best part about Xevious Arrangement, however, was the 2-player co-op for this game. Like Galaga Arrangement, 2 players could play simultaneously and take on the Xevious forces together. Sadly, there's been only one home port of this game, and it came with the PlayStation Home version of the next game on this lineup, Xevious 3DG. As the name implies, it came during the early days of the 3D boom, specifically releasing in Japanese arcades in May of 1996, with the PlayStation Home version releasing worldwide the following year. The main idea for the game was to take the original gameplay of Xevious and give it 3D models for graphics. It also included power-ups and pre-placed enemies, which sadly garnered criticism because many fans thought it threw a lot of what made the original great out the window. It was also panned for its short length and relatively low difficulty, and generally being less polished than other 2D shmups at the time, but it did receive credits for its graphics and music. The incredibly obscure next entry, Xevious Scramble Mission, went back to the original 2D style of presentation, but a far different gameplay style. This was part of the Japanese exclusive plug-and-play called Namco Nostalgia 1, released in 2006. This game was a time-based game where you fly through narrow corridors instead of wide-open areas, collecting flags and shooting enemies.
Guess I shouldn't be surprised that this one never left Japan.
Now there is one more game to cover on this Odyssey, Xevious Resurrection. And this may be the hardest to find of all. It was released in 2009 as part of the Namco Museum Essentials collection on PlayStation 3, being the only original title in the collection, with the other games being Pac-Man, Dig Dug, Galaga, Dragon Spirit, and the original Xevious. This is basically the same style of gameplay as Xevious Arrangement, but in glorious high definition! You battle through 16 areas through the Xevious forces en route to a showdown with the supercomputer GAMP, with co-op and a wide variety of enemies like before. There's also a shield button to protect you from enemy attacks, which depletes, but can be refilled by picking up power-ups from enemies. Interestingly enough, this game had integration with the short-lived PlayStation Home in the form of completing stamps by achieving certain in-game goals to earn swag for your pad. Unfortunately, you won't be able to do that anymore. That's because not only is PlayStation Home defunct, but this game, along with the rest of Namco Museum Essentials, was delisted in 2018, leaving you with no official means to play Xevious Resurrection. An ignominious end for such a game. When companies can just decide to make games unavailable on digital storefronts, is it any wonder why people turn to emulation? We just want to be able to play your games, but you just keep taking!
And about time, too!
Well, the truth is, while Xevious might not have had all that much consistency as a franchise, the original made an indelible impact on gaming. Without it, we wouldn't have had games like Rayforce or Ikaruga. We might not have had the beloved genre we have today. With a legacy like that, it's no wonder the game finds its way into nearly every Namco collection. It's had novels, it's had a movie, it's had soundtracks. It is a classic in every sense of the term. There was even a PS2 game in development, but sadly it got cancelled. But it goes to show why Xevious is so important and why it deserves its place among Namco's legends.
And rest assured, people are going to have plenty of opportunities to play this game for years to come. After all, Namco Bandai keeps putting out collections every so often, and the chance is higher than not that Xevious will be part of it. It would certainly be nice if they added some of those other games to the bargain as well. I'm the Quarter Guy, and until next time, the arcade is closed? Oh great, it's you.
So, have you been enjoying my little gifts?
Just what is the point of all of this, Genom? Leaving behind these Gashats for my reviews? Are you trying to infect me with a Bugster virus or something?
Well, if I told you the point, it wouldn't be any fun now, would it?
Look, if you have a beef with me, you're gonna have to come here, you know.
Don't be hasty. All good things in time, my friend. After all good things come in threes. See what I'm about to hear?
Just what is this clown planning?
As the release of the Mega Man Battle Network Legacy Collection draws near, please remember to exercise common sense on the internet. Be careful not to click suspicious links in emails or to download files you think may be harmful. Remember to keep your firewall program and anti-malware software up to date. Be aware of phishing schemes that may be targeting your personal information. And of course, be sure to keep a full stock of battle chips handy. Next time, top 10 worst net navies. It's game time! Hey everyone, QG here. If you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe, leave a comment, and share the video around. Feel free to check out my Twitter and my Twitch streams, and consider supporting me through Patreon and donating to my Extra Life campaign to support Children's Wisconsin. Thanks for watching.